Slum by Nikki Esposito. My first job was at a 24-hour restaurant called Flavi's on 3rd in Burlington and Westlake. It was a real hole-in-the-wall place, the type where patrons line up beneath the menu board, specializing in burgers, heroes, and all-day, grease-heavy breakfast. I worked graveyard shifts. So did most of my customers, the medical crowd. There were 2 middle-sized hospitals nearby, cops, firefighters, and the assorted civil servants that filtered in and out of the neighborhood. A middle-aged LAPD officer used to come by, sometimes with a partner, sometimes alone. Let's call him Officer Carlos Nunez. Officer Nunez didn't look like a cop. If I'd seen him at a grocery store, I'd have thought he were a professor or an attorney or a realtor. He had a square jaw and high forehead, curly brown hair, an endearing bald spot, and the friendly, diplomatic face of a sitcom dad. Officer Nunez had stories. On lazy nights, he would entertain his audience for hours. That audience consisting of Eagle Scout-looking fire babies, bored security guards, and nursing students off clinical shifts. 30 years with a badge and a car had given him plenty of material. When there were no kiddies to impress, he talked to me. Some of his stories were pretty dark. He saved those stories for the coldest, windiest nights, when Flavi's was empty, save for him and me and the cooks. Though it was nearly a decade ago, what he told me on one of those nights still lingers in the back of my mind. There's a building, he started, less than a mile from here, near 6th and Alvarado. It was abandoned, repossessed by the bank. They should have bulldozed the dump. It had been low-income housing, the Primrose Apartments. Originally office space, the building was bought at auction in 1999, gutted, and divided into cheap little white-walled units where the roofs leaked and the air conditioning never worked. In the early 2000s, Nunez was dispatched to the Primrose every couple weeks for the reasons one would expect. Domestic disturbances, possession with intent to sell, drunken brawls in the parking lot, solicitation, truancy, noise complaints. Nothing out of the ordinary for a public housing complex lodged within the bowels of a major city. Yet, somehow, embarrassingly, the building played on his nerves. I never liked the place, he told me. It was creepy. No building erected in the 70s has the right to be as creepy as that one. If he'd been asked to put a finger on the epicenter of this innate creepiness, he'd have pointed to a little closet on the first floor. The way he described it, coming from the back entrance, which only employees and cops ever used, a left turn would take you to a set of double doors, through which the elevator lobby and the leasing offices were accessible. A right turn led down a narrow hallway, past the janitor's storage to a dead end. The little closet in question was opposite the janitor's. The door was unlabeled, innocuous, and should have functioned as glorified wallpaper. But for Nunez, who'd stumbled upon the closet while looking for a restroom, even a glance towards it filled him with an irrational dread. A funny smell lingered about the door. He'd catch a faint tendril of the stench every time he walked through the back door. One night, Nunez and his partner, a lady cop who went by Rusty, were dispatched to the Primrose to investigate a domestic disturbance, a man threatening his girlfriend with a butcher knife. They found the woman locked in the bathroom and the boyfriend pounding on the door. Let's call the woman Marisol and the man Modesto. Nunez and Rusty managed to cajole the pair into cooperating. Rusty stayed in the bathroom with Marisol. Nunez sat in the kitchen with Modesto. Modesto claimed that Marisol was cheating on him with her ex-husband. He'd seen the ex hanging around the elevator lobby. When quizzed on the subject, Marisol insisted Modesto was crazy. Yes, she was still friendly with her ex-husband, but it was solely for the sake of their son. She had no desire to sleep with him. And besides, the ex-husband lived in Washington. It was suggested that Modesto had seen a man who resembled Marisol's ex. He got defensive. He strode into Marisol's son's room and came out with a framed picture. The son, with his arm around a taller, better-looking man. "I gotta say this every day," he ranted to Nunez. "You don't think I'd recognize this asshole if I saw him?" It took a while, but Modesto calmed down and admitted he may have been mistaken. Marisol didn't want to press charges, and the couple was left in peace. 2 weeks later, Nunez and Rusty were called to the same apartment for the same reason. This time, Marisol was barricaded in the master bedroom, and Modesto was brandishing a tire iron, insisting he'd had an enraging conversation with her ex-husband in the lobby. "You fucked him," he screamed. "He told me. He said you'd fucked him on our fucking bed." Backup was called. 30 minutes later, Modesto was cuffed, sobbing to a chair, while Marisol tearfully paced on the phone with her ex-husband, trying to prove he hadn't been hanging out in the lobby of the Primrose. "There," she cried finally. Triumphantly, she pulled up a picture on her phone and shoved it in Modesto's face. She handed the phone to Nunez. It was the man from the picture, her ex-husband, standing by a City of Winnichetti Street sign, holding a copy of the Winnichetti World with the day's date. "No way he flew here, fucked me, then flew back to Washington in time to take this picture." Modesto was asked to elaborate. Maybe he was the butt of a cruel trick. He said he'd been alone in the elevator lobby, checking his mail. The ex-husband stealthily came up beside him and had described in graphic, excruciating detail what he and Marisol had done while Modesto was at work. This time, Modesto was more difficult to pacify. He'd been suspicious for months, he told the cops. He knew the ex-husband had attempted to reconcile with Marisol. He was uncomfortable with their amicable relationship. And it didn't help that Marisol used her ex to stroke Modesto's jealousy. She'd call him whenever the two got into a fight, and constantly talked about how good a father and provider he was. Finally, they came to a resolution. Modesto went to stay with his brother. Marisol agreed to lock the doors, and a police car was dispatched to the neighborhood in case the ex-husband reappeared or Modesto got cute. Nunez didn't know what to make of the two of them. Modesto was obviously paranoid, but his fury and grief had been sincere. Marisol may have used her ex-husband to make her current beau jealous, but she'd seemed legitimately mystified by his accusations of infidelity. And Nunez highly doubted the ex-husband would have hopped a plane to Los Angeles just to fuck his ex-wife and stick it to her new boyfriend. And then there was the man in the elevator lobby. The man who might have been in the elevator lobby. Nunez and Rusty passed him on the way back to their squad car. A man leaning against the wall, face buried in a newspaper. Nunez saw the man and registered what he was seeing, but it took his subconscious a minute to process the information. Then, the realization of what he'd seen and its implications hit him like a ton of bricks, and he'd ran. Back through the back entrance, back through the double doors. The man was gone, and Nunez was left to wonder whether or not it had all been his imagination, because he could swear the man had been reading a copy of the Winnichetti World. Next, Nunez detailed an incident involving a middle-aged Bible thumper he called Dolores. Dolores lived on the second floor of the Primrose Apartments. She was a sweet lady, but painfully high-strung. At least once a week, the cops were summoned to her humble abode. She heard a noise after midnight. Call the cops. Two suspicious-looking men talking in the parking lot. Call the cops. Her son's out 5 minutes past curfew. Call the cops. It had gotten to the point where the dispatchers recognized her voice. Nunez had been sent to calm her down more than once. He believed that, truly, Dolores just needed someone to talk to. And she talked. A lot. She talked about her blackout-drunk past, about her husband who had fled in the dead of night with a shoebox full of cash she'd been saving for her kids to go to college, never to be seen or heard from again. She told him about how she'd found Jesus and how she wished her meth-addicted daughter would come home. The daughter had been in Bakersfield last, she'd heard, shacking up with her boyfriend du jour and 3 months pregnant. But that had been 2 years ago, and now her number was disconnected, and her mail got sent back, and all Dolores could do was pray for her grandchild. She talked about her son, Michael. He was 17 and a senior in high school. Michael was a good boy, she insisted, but she didn't like his friends. They were a bad influence on him, and lately he'd been avoiding her calls and coming late. He was surlier, angrier, and his clothes smelled like marijuana. He swore the pot smell had come from his friend's car, but Dolores was scared. She thought he was doing drugs. "I can't lose him," she'd sobbed to Nunez as he tried to convince her that the car stalling in the parking lot wasn't indicative of a drug deal. "Mike is all I have left." One September day, Nunez and Rusty were, yet again, dispatched to Dolores' apartment. He was more frustrated than concerned. They'd had a rough morning, and he wasn't in the mood to take notes on the explosion. Reed, upstairs neighbor, dropped a pot and lid. Dolores had heard, or nod and through one of her long-winded tales of motherly woe. But, according to the dispatcher, this time was different. Dolores, who usually took an assertive and condescending tone, had been screaming and crying. It was her son. He was hurt. The paramedics were 15 minutes away. Dolores answered the door, howling. Her prematurely wrinkled face was streaked with tears. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her hair stuck out where she'd pulled at it, and she was sobbing so violently she could barely speak. Michael, she panted, pointing towards a closed door. Michael, he's... She screamed, primal, animalistic. She cried out to the sky and collapsed on the floor, burying her tear-stained face in her knees. Even thinking about it, Nunez told me, was enough to make him tear up. All the pain and despair in the world was captured in that scream. Rusty tried to comfort Dolores. Nunez, hand on his gun, opened the door. The smell hit him immediately. Musty, like a basement after a rainstorm, mixed with something sweeter. the potpourri his mother had kept in a bowl. He breathed through his mouth. He flipped the light switch. A teenaged boy's room. In the far corner, a mattress with bedding kicked aside. On the mattress, a young man, no older than 18, was propped up against the wall. His head hung down, jaundiced blue eyes still open. Skinny, anorexic, purple blood pooling under waxen skin. Stringy red hair, blotched, infected track marks oozing pus. Joints stiff and contracted, swollen tongue lolling. Nunez buckled. He might have cried out. Trembling like a dog, he knelt by the boy. Given the dullness of the sunken cheeks and the violet hue of the flaccid limbs, he hypothesized the kid had been dead for hours, if not a day. Overdose. Slipping on a pair of latex gloves, holding his breath, he reached for the corpse's face. The glassy doll's eyes were too much to bear. If he closed them, his head would stop spinning and his hands would stop shaking, and he could function like an officer of the law, as opposed to a squeamish little. A hand clasped his arm. An icy, vice-strong claw grasped his arm. It took him a twisting, maddening second to realize what was happening. Michael's cold, dead, decomposing. Michael's chionic fingers were wrapped around his wrist. Nunez fell backwards. Michael sat up straight, folded, turned his torso. His stiff, angular joints jerked mechanically, grotesquely. His tarnished plastic eyes stared lifelessly ahead. Then the jaw moved, jostling the swollen, languid tongue, and with no respect for mechanics or anatomy, he spoke. Officer Nunez. A monotonous, alien mockery of a human voice. This will all burn. You will burn with it. Nunez grunted, kicked, tugged, broke free of the creature's grip. He twisted onto his hands and knees. He stumbled to the door, turned the knob, and fell into the living room, slamming the door behind him. Dolores was curled on the couch, sobbing quietly. Rusty stood in the doorway, waving to the paramedics, who were making their way down the hallway with their gurney. The boy, he's not... Nunez stammered. Rusty turned to him, then snapped her head back towards the hallway. What the fuck? A paramedic pushed past her into the apartment. On his heels was a teenage boy with longish red hair and blue eyes, dressed in khakis and an NWA sweatshirt, looking quite confused. It was Michael. Michael, very much alive. Dolores screamed. In one moment, she threw herself onto her son, collapsing with him to the dirty shag carpet, clutching him in a suffocating embrace. Rusty gave Nunez a look. The paramedic rolled his eyes. Dying boy found walking upstairs to his mother's apartment, he said sarcastically. Please tell me he's got an identical twin. It was a miracle Nunez held on to his shit, looking at Michael, healthy, breathing Michael, cradled in his mother's arms. He had never been so scared of a human being in his entire life. There's corpse, he managed to force out, eager to establish some context to the zombie movie jump scare he just experienced. Nunez grasped the doorknob with his right hand to pull himself up. Searing pain tore down his arm. He fell to his knees, groaning. The paramedic pushed past him, opened the door, looked in, and snorted. There's nothing there. Nunez managed to rise to his feet. He and Rusty peered into Michael's room. There was nothing. The mattress, save a bunch of comforter and sheets, was unoccupied. No blood, no excrements, just an empty teenager's bedroom. He did a lap of the room just to make sure. He shook out the comforter, dug through a hamper of dirty clothes, threw open the closet door. Nothing. No remnants of the atrophied, decomposing corpse that had threatened Nunez with fire. He sniffed the air. The musty potpourri smell still hung in the air, but it was fainter now, dissipated, despite the tightly closed window. Dolores, giddily, happy, concluded she must have imagined seeing her son's dead body. She didn't do any drugs, no sir, clean for 12 years, but had been under a lot of psychological stress, and lay awake nights, haunted by visions of her only remaining child, repeating her youthful mistakes. That, with the heat and the smog, it was enough to make anyone hallucinate. I saw the same thing she did, Nunez remembered saying. Michael sprawled dead on his mattress. At that, Dolores had frowned. What are you talking about, sprawled? I found him hanging in his closet. Nunez couldn't get out of there fast enough. It was weird, Rusty said, but not completely inconceivable. Dolores was delusional. Nunez had been overly susceptible to the power of suggestion and had imagined seeing a corpse because Dolores said there was a corpse. Induced psychotic disorder. I don't know, she told him. If you're really saying things, maybe you should take some time off. Go see the department shrink. Nunez had passed on the shrink. No use having someone else tell him he was crazy. But, as it turned out, the time off was involuntary. He woke up the next morning with his right wrist ballooning. Dislocation fracture. I must have fallen, he lied. No attention was paid to the 5 purple bruises around his wrist. So much like the prints of 5 strong, clutching fingers.